before we started recording, you used the word algorithmic to refer to the notion of the Cartesian sensibility, maybe even the Cartesian reduction of rationality.
Yes.
And I think that that's the place, like that, the how do I say this? Okay, so to the degree to which we find ourselves making the error of identifying rationality with algorithmic, we've painted ourselves into a corner, quite specifically, because that kind of rationality consists of, it's funny, I mean, I can't help it, there's a certain aesthetics here. It consists of the sort of the ultimately rather boring process of optimization.
Yeah.
It's kind of a search function. Right? In your Inventio, is that right? Inventio? To search and to discover?
Yeah. Inventio means to both search and discover, yes.
Right. So it's the search piece of that, right? It's a proposition. It's a fundamental hypothesis that the universe is in some sense prefigured and unchanging. And that what we do is we search it. And our job is to search it well. I mean, to search it efficiently. Yeah. So to find the shape of the phase space in which we are in with the least amount of searches, least amount of energy in the shortest time with the highest fidelity. Right? And that's the problem of that kind of rationality. The visual image I have right now is like of a wall, like a brick, a stone wall, and like a laser scanner that's trying to map that into a 3D model. Right?
Yeah. Excellent.
That's what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to really convert reality into a model of reality with velocity and fidelity and with the least amount of energy, although a laser is pretty expensive in energy. And that's cool. And it's super useful. And quite often we find ourselves in environments that are of that sort. But here's the thing, and I've actually had this conversation now 3 times in the past couple of weeks, so I guess it's right. You know, at the end of the day, that's prefigured on a rather unproven, and I would say somewhat how would I say this, self-contradictory metaphysics, an assumption, in fact, an axiom, that the universe is strictly non-innovative.
Right.
Somehow there was a big bang. This typically comes from folks who are kind of coming from the more, let's call it, not even scientific, but scientistic world, and maybe computational, which is sort of a subset of that. But you know, they'll take the standard model of physics, and accept, that's the story. So the notion is, okay, well, yeah, there was a moment. In the beginning there was a big bang. So there was one point where creation happened. Not quite sure what the hell that's all about, how we went from nothing to something, but I do know this for sure. Once we went from nothing to something, that was the end of that. Then it's just been kind of like the playing out of somethingness in what appears to be time, right? Because under the standard model, it's all kind of like a single fixed light cone, and the sense of time is actually false, which that doesn't make any sense. Like the sense of time is the point, right? It's the sense of it. You can't have a false sense of sensing. Anyway, that's just a whole other digression. But so the problematic there, of course, is so we talk about this notion of strong emergence. It's funny, like we're dropping into that dialogue, that set of languages.
Yeah.
And the problematic of the question of strong emergence is to say, look, if you accept the premise that your ontology and your metaphysics has a slot called innovation at all, like more than nothing, and if something can come from nothing at all, even once, then the burden of proof is in some sense on you to demonstrate that it's not always happening. Like, why wouldn't that just be constantly going on? What would be the thing? Like, why would it be the case that creation happens once and then doesn't happen? Well, okay, then what happens is that you flip and say, well, what would it look like to say that we're actually in a fundamentally creative universe? That novelty is always happening, by the way, and more importantly, there's a real serious novelty where it comes and becomes part of the fabric of the universe in which we're seated.
Right.
Well, the problem is this, right? The problem is that the model of algorithmic rationality is premised on a finite state space.
Yes.
If you've got a combinatorial explosion where the n is infinity, then your computational capacity to search that has to be also infinite.
Right.
Well, that kind of puts the kibosh on that, because if you have a truly creative universe, right, if there's no bounding on the size of possibility space, then what that means is you actually have a infinite universe, which means that your algorithmic efforts are, well, they're practical, right? But they're not fundamental, right? They cannot ever be absolute, nor could they ever be the kind of thing upon which you could put, you might call a solid foundation, like a firm, for sure, forever. Which is, that ideology or that effort was what was his name? Hilbert? The guys in the early 20th century, late 19th
and Russell
century.
and Whitehead, right? And of course, Whitehead is coming to mind.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Right.
We want to get this shit locked down. We're going to spend 10 years writing a big ass book to lock this shit down. Turns out, can't do that. Right. That was like, okay, that's the great demoralization of the early 20th century.
Right.
But I think and Whitehead, I think, is the guy who he recovered, right? He bounced off. He's like, okay, I gotta adjust to reality, which is a really powerful move. What's that look like? And then you get this process of the notion of, okay, we're actually in a creative universe.
Yes.
So our challenge is now, in fact, in some sense, shifted from a epistemological one to an ethical one.
Yes.
Right? Yes. The question is, how, in fact, just do we live? How do we make choices? On an ongoing basis in a space that is, on the one hand, for sure, not strictly definable, either practically or theoretically, and it's going to be constantly surprising. It's going to keep throwing up new shit that didn't even exist in universe a moment ago. Now, if that's the task of rationality, we've got a much more interesting problem. Mm-hmm. And sorry, that was quite a dialogue.
No. That was excellent. I really liked
that. Off the cuff, entirely improvisational. Well, obviously not entirely. I've thought about this quite a bit, but so the last image that came up, and I think it's really beautiful, is what I think is really the grounding of that algorithmic sense, but the grounding is more honorable, which is the stonemason or the architect. Mm-hmm. The notion of tools for designing things well. And if you want to design a wall, you really need to have a rock solid algorithmic mapping of the constraint space that you actually find yourself in. Right? The better you can actually know, okay, it's going to be this tall, and this is the sway, and here's the variance, that kind of stuff, that quality of rationality that becomes increasingly necessary the more fine-grained the techne that you're engaged in. Yeah. That's the grounding. You're really thinking about it from the point of view of essentially the artisan's rationality.
Yeah.
Then you're like, okay, cool. Because the artisan's rationality is also at the bottom practical. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to have this obsession with knowing everything. It just needs to be able to, or having a notion of, I need to get to a perfect mapping. It's just, my job is to have the right kind of mapping to do the job that I'm doing very well. Again, it loops back to the ethical. And from the epistemological back to the ethical, in this case, also the aesthetic.
Yeah.
I want to build a beautiful wall, as well as a wall that stands.
Yes.
Right? And a wall that was a good wall to build, that is actually, it's a good choice all in. Wow. You can go a lot there, but let me stop there.